Hey coders, how's it going? Mohammedu here, back again. And throughout this lesson, we're going to be learning about types in Python. So in Python, types define the kinds of values that can be created and used. Python comes with many built-in types. And when we say built-in types, this just means these types are prepackaged into the Python language. So they come out of the box. We don't have to do anything to be able to use these types. And each type in Python has its own characteristics, behaviors, and specific operations that can be performed on them. Some of the types that we will be exploring throughout this lesson include numbers such as integers and decimal numbers. We will also discuss Booleans, which represent true and false values. In addition, we will also talk about sequences, such as being able to represent textual data and lists of information. So over the next few videos, we will dive deeper into each one of these types and understand how they work. So I'll see you all in the next few videos. The bool type in Python is also known as the Boolean type. Boolean values are often used in programming for logical operations and decision making. Basically, sometimes in programming, you need to know whether something is true or false. Boolean values are represented as one of two values. And that is basically true or false. And that's essentially it for the bool type. None is a special built-in type in Python that represents the absence of a value. It's typically used as a placeholder or a default value when you need to indicate that something doesn't exist yet or hasn't been given a meaningful value. So to represent the none value, it's quite simple. We go ahead and spell out none with a capital N. And that's essentially it for the none type. The int type in Python represents integer numbers, which are whole numbers without any fractional or decimal parts. Integers can be positive, negative, or zero. Next, let's go over a few examples of valid integers in Python. So we can have the number 10. We can also have 100. We can even have 1,000,000. And it's important to note that when we're dealing with larger integer numbers, we do not include commas in the number. We can also have the number 0. We can also have negative integers, such as negative 100. We can have negative 234, negative 678, and even negative 1. So these are just some examples of different integers that you can have. But any number is an integer as long as the number does not include decimal parts. So that essentially wraps up the int type. The float type represents floating point numbers, which are numbers that can have a fractional part. In other words, floats are used to represent numbers with decimal points. Floats can be positive or negative. So let's look at a few examples of floating point numbers in Python. So we can have the number 10.0, or we can also just have 10 point. So it is not required to have numbers after the decimal point, and this would still be treated as a floating point number. So in this case, these two numbers will be regarded as the same. We can also have larger floating point numbers, such as 14,000.001. And when dealing with larger floating point numbers, commas are omitted. We can also have 0.4, and we can also have negative floating point numbers, such as negative 10,000.1. We can also have negative 9.4 and negative 0.1. One important characteristic of floats is that the number must include a decimal point. Forgetting to include the decimal point will result in the number becoming an int. So say we have the number 3. Because we don't have a decimal point, this is an int. But say we include a decimal point, this now becomes a float. Similarly, if we have 3.0, this would also be a float. So if you want to create a floating point number, remember that you have to include the decimal point. Otherwise, the number will be treated as an int. The str type in Python represents strings, which are sequences of characters. Strings are used to represent textual data, such as words, sentences, and even paragraphs. Strings can have 0 or more characters, and they can contain letters, numbers, symbols, spaces, and even punctuation. Now in Python, we can create two different kinds of strings. We have strings that can span a single line, and we have strings that can span multiple lines. Now the way to create these kinds of strings slightly differ. So for now, we will just focus on creating strings that can only span a single line. So we'll put a comma here that says strings that can span only one line. So we can do this in one of two ways. The first way is using single quotes, and the second way is using double quotes. So in this case here, this is the empty string. So let's put a comment here. We'll put an empty string, and we'll also include another comma here and say, oh, this should be an empty string. So there is no difference between either of these two methods to create a string. Python has no differentiation between either of these methods. It's really just a matter of preference. So now let's create some strings that actually have characters in them. So I'll use the single quotes and I'll say, hello world. I'll create another string, and this time I'll use double quotes and I'll say, how is your day going? And I'll include a question mark. I'll create another string using single quotes and I'll say, how is module 1 going so far? Exclamation mark and a question mark. I'll create another string using double quotes and I'll say, we are currently learning about strings. So one thing to keep in mind when you're creating strings, if you're going to create a string using single quotes, then you want to make sure that the string starts with a single quote and ends with a single quote. Similarly, if you're going to create a string that starts with a double quote, then that string must end with a double quote. You cannot mix and match. So what that means is you cannot start a string with a single quote and then try to end with a double quote. The way you start the string is the same way you have to end the string. Next, let's create some more strings. And this time I want to create a string that actually is going to include the single quote to be a part of the actual string. So what that would look like is essentially having an apostrophe inside the string. So let's say I have a string and we're going to say, what's your name? Now in Python, the first quote denotes the beginning of the string. And the very next quote that it sees denotes the end of the string. So to Python, it thinks that this is the entire string. And it's not quite sure what the rest of this is. And so if we were to run this, we would actually see an error. And Python is actually telling us we have a syntax error. And it's saying that starting from the letter S, it has no idea what this is. Because if this is the string, then to Python, it's not sure what the rest of this is, specifically S. So when you get errors in Python, don't be intimidated. It's really good to look at the console, investigate, and understand what it's saying. And as you do this more and more, you'll start to become more experienced. And when you see these kinds of errors, you'll immediately understand what the problem is. And you'll be able to make these adjustments in your code. So coming back to the string here, we know that we want this apostrophe to be included in the actual string. We don't want Python to think that this is the end of the string. So how can we go about doing this? Well, there's actually a character that we can use to let Python know to include this apostrophe to be a part of the string. And that is referred to as the escape character. The escape character is represented as the backslash character. And essentially, what this does is it tells Python that the character that comes immediately after this backslash should be a part of the actual string. So now, Python regards this first quote as the beginning of the string, is going to ignore this and treat it as a part of the string, this quote here, and then the next quote that it sees is going to be treated as the end of the string. So now if we were to run this, we don't see any errors. In fact, we see no output at all. So this exact same thing holds true when we're dealing with strings that contain the double quote. So let's create a new string, and this string will say, he said hello. So we'll create a string using the double quotes, and we'll say he said hello. Now, if we look at the string, we have the same problem. Because we started our string with a double quote, the very next double quote denotes the end of the string. So to Python, it thinks that this is the entire string, and it has no idea what H is. And if I were to run this, you will see here that I have a syntax error, and it's pointing right at the H because it has no idea what H is, right? Because this is the entire string, and now I have something invalid. And that's essentially what a syntax error is. It means that what you're trying to do doesn't make sense in Python. So every language has its rules. In the English language, you have your rules. And if you don't abide by those rules, we would say that's a grammatical error. Similarly, in Python, if you're trying to do something that doesn't exist in the language, then you would get a syntax error. So coming back to this, how can we include this hello to be a part of the string? So similarly, as before, if we want this double quotation to be a part of the string and not denote the end of the string, then we can use the escape character. So we'd use a backslash right before the double quote to let Python know that this should be included in the actual string. And we'll do the same thing for the next double quote here. So now Python knows that this double quote and this double quote should be included to be in the string. And now this double quote at the beginning will denote the beginning of the string, and the next double quote will denote the end of the string. So let's go ahead and run this again. And as you can see, we don't see that syntax error anymore. And in fact, we don't have any output at all. So looking at this string, or looking at both of these strings, this can be a bit hard to read. We have all of these escape characters, and it's not very clear. And there's actually a way where we can avoid having to use the escape character just to include either the single quote or the double quote to be a part of our actual string. So the way we can do this is, if we know that we want to include a single quote in our string, then we can opt for creating a string using the double quote. So I'm going to go ahead and pretty much create this same string here again. What's your name? So here we have what's your name. And as you can see, this string works just fine. And I can prove that by running it. So as you can see, no output was detected. And that's because we started our string with a double quote and we ended our string with a double quote. And there's only 2 double quotes in this string. So Python isn't even going to assume or think that this is the end of the string because we didn't create this string using single quotes. Next, let's see how we can recreate this string here, he said hello, without having to include the escape character. So we know that we want the double quote to be included in the actual string. So what we can do is we can create a string using the single quote. So we'll go ahead and we'll have he said hello. And if we go ahead and run this, we don't have any syntax errors. And we also don't have any escape characters in the string. And we're able to do this because we started the string with a single quote. So Python reads the very next single quote to denote the end of the string. And that is essentially here. So by default, everything else in between these 2 single quotes will automatically be regarded as part of the string. So as mentioned before, there is no difference between creating strings using the single quote or the double quote. From a Python perspective, they're the exact same thing. and there's no differentiation between them. However, as you can see, there may be situations where it might make more sense to create your string using single quotes versus double quotes, and vice versa. Because creating a string that doesn't have escape characters is easier to read and more clear. So that's essentially it for strings that can only span a single line. Let's learn a little bit about strings that can span multiple lines. These are also referred to as multi-line strings, or sometimes referred to as doc strings. So multi-line strings, also known as doc strings. Let's go ahead and move this up a bit. We can create multi-line strings in one of two ways. The first way is surrounding our sequence of characters around a pair of triple single quotes. And the second way is surrounding our sequence of characters around a pair of triple double quotes. So let's see this in action. And first we can start by creating the empty multi-line string. So we'll do this initially using a pair of triple single quotes. And we'll create the empty multi-line string again, but this time we'll use a pair of triple double quotes. And let's go ahead and leave a comment here, and we'll say an empty multi-line string. Let's actually go ahead and fix that. Let's leave another comment here. So an empty multi-line string. So we know that multi-line strings can also span a single line. So let's create a few multi-line strings that only span one line. So first we'll start off by creating a multi-line string using the triple single quotes. And we'll say, how are you doing today? And we'll close this string with triple single quotes. Next, we'll create another multi-line string, but this time we'll use a pair of triple double quotes. And this text will say, today we are learning about multi-line strings. How exciting. And we'll end the string with triple double quotes. Next, let's create some multi-line strings that span multiple lines. So we'll start off with triple double quotes, and we'll say, this is a multi-line string, also known as a doc string. And we'll create another multi-line string again, but this time we'll use a pair of triple single quotes. And we'll have the text, good morning. I hope you have a great day. So it is important that when you're creating multi-line strings, the way you start the string is the same way you end it. So if you want to create a multi-line string, then the type of quote you use on each side of the string does matter. For example, if you create a multi-line string using triple single quotes, then you must start and end the string with triple single quotes. Similarly, if you want to create a multi-line string using triple double quotes, then you must start and end the string with triple double quotes. You cannot mix and match. Doing so will result in a syntax error, and you will see the output here in the terminal. One thing that I wanted to point out when using multi-line strings is sometimes you may want to include the single quote in the string or the double quote in the string. And depending on how you create your multi-line string, you may have to use the escape character. So let's look at an example of this. Next, let's create a string using triple double quotation marks. And this string will have the text, his name is Prince. And we'll have Prince inside quotation marks. So let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we have a syntax error. And the arrow is pointing right at the last quotation. Now this happens because we started our string with triple double quotation marks. So what that means is the very next triple double quotation marks that Python sees, it will automatically think that that is the end of the string. And so if we look here, we see that here we have triple double quotation marks. So Python thinks that this is the entire string, and it has no idea what this quotation mark is. And that's what we see here in the error. It's pointing right at the last one. So we know that we want this quotation mark right after the letter E to be included in this string, then we have to use the escape character. And so by doing that, Python now knows that this here is going to be treated as a character in the actual string. So if we go ahead and run this again, we have no errors. Here we can see no output was detected. Next, let's create another string, and this time we'll use a pair of triple single quotes. And this string will also have the text, his name is Prince. And we'll have Prince wrapped around a pair of single quotes. So let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we have a syntax error. And this arrow is pointing at the last single quote. Now this happens because we started the string with triple single quotes. So Python is going to look at the next triple single quotes that it finds and treat that as the end of the string. And the last triple single quotes that it sees are these three here. And as you can see, there's one left at the end. And that's what this error is referring to, because Python thinks that this is the entire string. And that's why we get a syntax error. Now we know that we want this single quote at the end of the word Prince to be included in the string. So in this case, we want to use the escape character. And so we can run this again, and now we no longer have a syntax error. So we want to create a multi-line string that spans a single line, but we don't want to include the escape character, then what we can do is we can just choose to use different kind of quotes. So for example, in this case here, if we know that we want a double quote to be in the string, then we can create a multi-line string that uses triple single quotes. So we can do this. His name is Prince. And similarly, if we know we want single quotes to be in the string, then we can create a multi-line string using a pair of triple double quotes. So we'll have the same text as before. His name is Prince, wrapped in single quotes. And so if we run this, we see that we have no syntax errors. So that's how we can get around having to use this escape character. And our string is a lot more readable without having these extra characters in the string. So that essentially wraps up multi-line strings. And I think that concludes the stir type. The list type in Python represents a collection of items that are ordered and modifiable. For example, think of a list of grocery items, or a list of countries that you'd like to visit one day, or a list of books that you plan on reading sometime in the future. So just like how in the real world, we can use lists to hold data, we can also do the same thing in Python. Python lists can store data that contains different kinds of types, such as the types that we have gone over so far. So think about Booleans, integers, floating point numbers, strings, and even other lists. To create a list in Python, we use the open and close brackets. So it would look something like this. And here we have an empty list. So in Python, a list can contain 0 or more elements. So let's go ahead and include a comment here. So we'll say an empty list. And next, let's create some other lists that have multiple items. So each item in the list will be separated by a comma. So let's create a list of numbers, and this list will contain the numbers 1 through 7. Next, let's create some more lists, and this time we'll create a list that has Booleans. So we'll do true, false, true, and true. Next, we'll create a list that contains strings. So we'll do hello and world. So in these lists that we've created, they all contain one single type. The first list contains only integers, the next list contains only Booleans, and the next list contains only strings. Lists in Python can also contain data that has different kinds of types. So for example, we can have a list that contains integers, strings, Booleans, and floats. So let's go ahead and create a list that contains these different kinds of data types. So here we have integer, we have a float, we have a string, we have a Boolean, and we have another list. So lists in Python are extremely flexible and are extremely versatile. And over the next few lessons, we will learn about all the different things that we can do with lists.